Welcome to Through the Glass Columns, your weekly Wheel of Time read along podcast. The Wheel of Time turns and ages come and pass, leaving memories that become legend. Legend fades to myth, and even myth is long forgotten when the age that gave it birth comes again.
That is your host, Greg, who somehow still knows very little about the Wheel of Time, even though he usually pretends otherwise.
And that is Tylor, our resident expert, who makes sure you know how much he knows about the Wheel of Time.
It's a lot. Join us each week as we continue our journey through Robert Jordan's great fantasy epic, exploring the books, the television show, ill-advised discussions of visual media on a non-visual podcast, and so much more. Although actually not, it's just that.
Yes, all that and actually nothing else as we travel on, and I know what this means now, through the glass columns.
Yeah, he really doesn't know all that much.
No, you don't know that much.
Hi there. Welcome back to Through the Glass Columns, your weekly Wheel of Time read-along podcast. You are joined today by me, Greg, the host who still somehow knows very little about the Wheel of Time. And I, of course, am joined by the real Sedai in the room. It's Tylor. Tylor, how are you?
I'm doing pretty well. Aes Sedai is an odd comment as a way to describe, your male friend. But other than that, I appreciate it, right?
I don't know these things.
I will accept the power dynamic that comes along with that, my warder. I thought that these were fun chapters this week, and then I'll be honest, I put down my book and was like, oh no, what do we say about them? Like, I had a very kind of two minds about what was going on. I enjoyed the reading and do not quite know how to condense these into big thoughts that we can discuss. Of course, this week we're talking about Chapter 41, The Craft of Kin Tovere, and Chapter 42, Before the Arrow. So, Greg, what are your thoughts on this? Is this a lot happens, so we don't have much to say? Is it a bunch of kind of reminders, and so it's hard to comment on things we've already commented on? What did you feel as kind of the overall vibe of these chapters? Because it definitely felt like there was momentum, just maybe not plotty momentum.
Well, Tylor, I'm not a golfer, but if I were one, I might imagine the kind of pregnant anticipation one might feel as you reach into your golf bag and select a tee and set up your ball right on the tee, just feeling the satisfaction of the curve of the tee fitted against the ball, and then stabbing it gently into the ground, knowing that you're going to step back and take a mighty swing and whack that ball into oblivion. But I can't imagine it's that much fun to do. So I might say that I felt like this was the perfect set of chapters to tee up what I think will be an incredible drive next week through the glass columns. No, we gotta keep going.
Yeah, honestly.
All right.
So I think it's time that we then just dive straight into the chapters, right? If the big overall impression is we're almost there, then I think it's time to get there. So let's begin with Chapter 41, The Craft of Kin Tovere. Rand looks over all of the camps of the people who are following him, including both dispirited Terran and Kyrianan horse soldiers, cavalry, and also a group of infantry who apparently are kind of looked down on in their culture. And there's clearly enough division between the countries that all of the different camps seem kind of on edge, even around the people who are supposedly their ally. Rand studies the leader of them all, Wiramon, who has gathered the assembled soldiers, but seems seriously overconfident about his ability, and particularly the cavalry's ability, to overrun the Aiel. He thinks that he should be able to attack immediately. He brings news of both land and sea raids by Ilion, and Rand knows that this must be Samael trying to draw him out. Rand thinks about Wiramon's request to attack, and then he also notes that Cerelia, who is even older than all of the other Wise Ones, has seemingly taken a lead among the Wise Ones, and he is somewhat confused by this development. He thinks of it as almost more important than the emergence of all of these Kyrianan and Terran soldiers. He studies Aviendha, who is nearby, who is now seemingly friendly with him and not always cautious about being around him and what she's saying and doing, and he feels confused by this, but she also seems more relaxed than she has, and he seems kind of pleased by this. The Aiel clan chiefs joke about hunting, and it's clear that they think they could hunt the Cairienin, and Rand thinks that he could be friends with any of them, even though they are kind of subservient to him at this point. He starts to climb a hill, and he sees a tower that has been constructed of logs by a number of Cairienin refugees. Moraine is at the base of the tower with Lan and Egwene, who Egwene in particular is looking more Aiel by the day, according to Rand, and he can almost not distinguish her from one of the wise ones. He asks Egwene if she has decided, and she says she will help. He then thinks about what this means, and he is intending for her to channel in battle, and he thinks that Moraine cannot do this because of the three oaths, and Moraine clearly disapproves of Egwene doing it, but is not going to step in and stop it. Moraine asks Rand why he wears a sword again, and he basically replies, why not, and thinks that was not a good enough answer, but he was caught off guard. The wound on his side from Falm is bothering him, and he thinks that everyone except for Wiraman is eager to climb up to the tower as they're following him, and there he sees Kin Tovere and his assistants, who apparently Kin Tovere is an expert in telescopes or viewing things from afar, and the tower was Rand's idea as an opportunity to get the angle needed to see Cairien from an extremely long distance. Rand and the clan chiefs are all there to study the soldiers of the Aiel, particularly Couladin's soldiers, and determine what they can change about their plan in order to adapt to anything he has done. When Rand looks through the telescope, he can see Cairien, and he notes that half of the banners are his and the other half are Terran banners, and so there is actually no one flying the Cairienin flag in Cairien. Rand then spots Couladin, who we learn apparently Asmodean was the one who gave him his dragon tattoos, and it seems that someone is able to throw spears from an enormous distance because one of them from the city nearly hits Couladin. Rand thinks that this tower allows them to update their scouting much more quickly than they could otherwise, and he thinks that Couladin's death in battle may not be enough to settle this war, and he thinks that he can be as hard as he needs to be, just as Aviendha advised him to be. Boy, do I not have a lot to say about this chapter, even though in that summary, a bunch of stuff kind of happens. What did you kind of take away from this chapter, where I feel like we got a lot of little hints of what has changed in the past few weeks, but it's kind of hard to get excited about things that have subtly shifted?
I mean, you don't get much more literal than getting the lay of the land than a chapter where he's literally surveying the land and telling you exactly what he sees and kind of putting these all laying out. It's well, wait, I mean, I don't know when this is, but maybe it's December. And December around my house is Lord of the Rings season. I think every year since it came out, it's time to, get a rewatch of the three original, the extended editions. Come on. We have taste. We have civility. And so I found myself thinking a lot about some of those big sweeping shots of like the army lined up in front of Helm's Deep. Oh, I also went to the movie theater this week and saw a new Lord of the Rings movie, which is very good. People should go see. There's an animated War of the Rohirrim movie, which may or may not feature Helm's Deep, which is why I was thinking of that just now. But you get those kind of establishing shots, and they are not like thrilling, but they're really important because they give you both the landscape so that you understand what you're about to see, but also they give you the scale of what's happening. And, if you compare those shots of Helm's Deep to the ones of Minas Tirith in Return of the King, you're like, oh my God, like there's so many more armies here. And look at how massive this battlefield is and how big the city is and all those things. And, it's something those films do really well. Can we turn this into a Lord of the Rings?
Yeah, we probably just should at this point. Yeah.
And yet for all that love, I still haven't watched Rings of Power, even though, or the second season anyway. But I think that's what's important here, and it's actually pretty well done. I've also been reading a book which did an extended metaphor, which I won't get into, but it was essentially about how landscape painters, before there were cameras, would actually go to like many different hills and try to assemble from those different perspectives. And so that was on my mind for this as well, that, between this and the next chapter, it's kind of giving you multiple perspectives on the lay of the land so that you can kind of, in the mind of the reader, assemble those two pieces and get a pretty clear understanding of what things look like, presumably on the eve of a great battle.
Yeah, and I really like that as an idea in terms of how this chapter plays out, because it is very much Rand kind of piecing together a bunch of people's different advice and kind of ways of thinking about this upcoming battle. And so seeing him kind of decipher what is important information and what is not important information feels like exactly what you're describing Robert Jordan is doing here in terms of just giving us kind of all of the kind of background we need so we can dive in with a full kind of fleshed out understanding of what's going on here. The most notable piece of this to me was I was really expecting the kind of standard Aiel, Kyrian, Terran divisions. That feels very kind of what we've seen before. I think this new introduction of the cavalry infantry divide I thought was really interesting. It's not something we've seen in other cultures, so it kind of sets Tyr and Kyrian apart in very much a Helm's Deepy horse warrior kind of way, but it also, I think, sets up an interesting place. We've seen Rand before be kind of the hero of the common folk. Being the hero of the infantry also feels like an interesting place for Rand to be when he's kind of planning this battle.
I really just wanted to shout King Theoden's speech as he runs down the ramp, but I will spare our listeners' ears me shouting at them. I think this was an interesting point. So I would sum it up in 2 points, and that was my first, which is, this divide within Kyrian.
But
Kyrian, oh man, you're going to see why I messed that up in just a minute. Kyrian culture. But to me, that's a class issue, and, who can afford the horses, right? And dividing the commoners from the elites. I think I've made this reference before, but, it immediately took me in mind to the Iliad, where you have the named noble lords, and they'll be like, 1,000 people fought another 1,000 people, but let's just talk about these two who were squaring off like in the center of that as kind of a class difference. And so certainly this feels like, if Rand wants to be the hero of the people, he should be, tied to those infantry, or care more about those infantry in some ways.
Yeah, and I think that's what's so interesting about this story from the Rand and the Terran lords, especially Lord Wiraman kind of steps forward as the lead of that in this chapter, is he is a character who is very clearly not acknowledging kind of that his worldview may be flawed, but then also we have this really interesting moment where Rand kind of calls him out on what is going on between Tyr and Ilion, and the response that he gets from Wiraman seems to be kind of shifting as the discussion is going on, where initially it's like, it's no big deal, don't worry about it, this happens all the time, and then Rand presses him on that, and it's like, oh, this is extremely serious, we should get back there immediately and ignore all this Kyrian business. And the fact that we are kind of finally getting a leader among this really disparate group, and it turns out to be the worst leader possible, I feel like is just emblematic of what Rand is fighting against. And it's why I'm kind of more interested in this plot than I would be if it was just Rand leading the Aiel against Couladin leading the other Aiel.
Well, and I think this is basically the same point stated a different way, but that's much more compelling than, like, Rand marches through and everybody just follows him and it's great, to, like, no, right? You have to deal with these petty grievances between factions within your army, both, the ones we're talking about. And also, they're not going to behave when you turn your back. Like, you ran off into the waste, so they're going to, pillage as best they can for as long as they can. And so I think we're going to continue to see a kind of messiness to this, which actually I would say is something that Lord of the Rings often does not have. Lord of the Rings is so easily like monster people versus beautiful human people that we don't really get that kind of factionalism that we're seeing here.
But there's one guy whose name is Wormtongue, who we all trust for a little while, right? Like, yeah,
totally.
No, I think you're exactly right here. The only other note that I had kind of related to this early section of the chapter is I found it was really interesting just how, like, heavy-handed the plan of the Forsaken seems to be. right? We've seen multiple chapters in this book where they have been discussing we're going to draw Rand in and he's going to attack Samael and that's when we can strike. And Rand is already like, yeah, it's really obvious Samael wants me to attack him, right? Like, he doesn't have any of the information we do. There should be some dramatic irony here, but like, he figured it out. And that really makes me wonder, is Robert Jordan holding something back, or do the Forsaken think that Rand is this dumb? I don't think we have enough to draw a conclusion, but we're reaching a point where this is like the 8th time that Samael has done something to draw him in, and even Rand has got it. I feel like this is that episode of The Good Place. Like, Rand figured it out? Oh, this is a real low point.
So that was my second point, was just that it seemed like this chapter really wanted to remind you, don't get totally distracted by these armies and this kind of battle, that remember who's pulling the strings behind the scene. And we get these reminders about Asmodean being the one who set up the false dragon, and then Samael and those traps. So you offered me a dichotomy to pick from here, and I'm going to pick the first half. I think that this feels like the Forsaken have the kind of obvious plot that they want to get discovered, while the real plot moves behind the scenes somewhere, or is something that Rand won't attack. And so now we're getting into, irresponsible speculation. I will say that the conclusion of this book will be that kind of whip the rug out from under you, where Rand will have conquered and seemed victorious in that superficial level plot, only to realize that there was something much deeper and darker that he missed. And so he leaves book 5. I keep forgetting. My wife just was like, which book do you need? I'm going to a bookstore. I was like, the one after the Fires of Heaven. But that we will leave book 5 kind of, or head into book 6 thinking like, oh no, like this is very bad. Like, we're going to get that really obvious push towards a next big piece. And you can't say anything. Haha.
You know what I can say? When you said, oh no, this feels really bad, that's kind of how I feel about Rand looking at Aviendha and being like, hey, she's really happy. Everything seems to be going well. She's just ignoring anything romantic between us. Like,
she's just retiring in one day. Like, don't worry about it. She's fine.
that is not a good sign. For anyone out here who was fighting with their wife yesterday and nothing changed and now they're being really quiet, go buy her flowers. Don't.
Now.
It's not fine.
Too funny.
Any thoughts on either Aviendha, or we do get this interesting new addition? Apparently there is a new wise one who is older than all of the other wise ones, and she is driving in terms of who is in charge these days. Cerilia is a new name other than one or two quick mentions. Any thoughts on the Aiel portion of this chapter before we go up a tower and look at some glass?
I can't remember if this is where it is, but this is where Rand suggests he asked Egwene to use the power. And so I thought the takeaway from that was that Egwene is somehow more devout than Moraine, seemingly, right? That Moraine might be a little more open to possibilities, but Egwene is certainly not. Is that the right read?
I think the interesting thing here is that Moraine doesn't give us enough to know what her opinion on this is, because Moraine cannot answer yes to that request. The 3 oaths prevent her from doing so, right? So it's worth noting the 3rd oath of the 3 oaths is to not use the power as a weapon unless they are defending their life or fighting, I believe it's dark spawn. I don't think there's even an exception for dark friends unless they're protecting their own life. So Moraine just physically could not do this. And so the only hint that we get that Moraine is like not as willing to support Rand, or maybe like more kind of she insists she wants Egwene to follow the 3 oaths, is that a moment where she's kind of stonily silent when Egwene agrees. But the trick here is Rand never asked her, and so we don't actually get kind of what is her position on it, which makes this, I think, a more fun scene to read, because you're trying to figure out what Moraine is thinking, which is always a difficult game. I thought that was really interesting, and also thought the fact that Rand literally thought that Egwene was a wise one briefly before he realized Egwene just has a really big tan and is dressing like a wise one. Like, that was a moment that I think really stood out. We've been getting little hints at Egwene acting more like an Aiel, but she now apparently looks like a very short Aiel.
Yeah. I mean, again, it's a problematic term, but in literature, this trope of kind of going native, right? That you get so indoctrinated into the culture. Sorry, Tyler, do you want me to make that specifically about Avatar for your tastes, or no? Okay. In my rewatch of all the Best Picture winners in history, I am about to get to Dances with Wolves, so I think that means I can give you a different reference to the exact same plot line. But like that is interesting, especially because prior to this trip that Egwene took with Rand, it seemed like Egwene was being positioned to be like the next head of the Aes Sedai, and I'm not saying that's impossible now, but certainly somebody who has gone this native would be startling to whoever's in the White Tower.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely correct. And as you're thinking about how kind of tightly Egwene is kind of tying herself to the Wise Ones, that raises a really interesting question to me, kind of tying these two Egwene pieces together. We know that Moiraine cannot and will not participate in the battle because she is bound by the Three Oaths. We know that Egwene is angering her by participating in the battle and using the One Power. What we don't know is whether Egwene is doing that with the support of the Wise Ones, or whether the Wise Ones are also disagreeing with her and she is striking out on her own, which also leaves the question, are the Wise Ones going to channel in battle? And those, I think, are kind of the interesting dangling threads we're left as we then kind of go up the stairs and get to look through telescopes, which apparently are very futuristic here.
Nothing else to say really about that portion. I am interested to see where that goes, and particularly in the context of what they talk about more specifically in the next chapter. So I'll be quiet now. So telescopes. Hey, these are cool. You can see things far away, like they're very close. So I will say I felt like obviously the lay of the land portion of this felt most important to remind us that this was a bustling city, but everything outside the city is in ruins. Specifically, the granaries have been burned down, and that's caused rioting. That seemed like a major plot point that will affect whoever the winner of this battle is, probably Rand. And so then the other one I liked was the kind of pause to talk about how the river is blocked and how that's just like not an option. I thought was kind of like Robert Jordan trying to outsmart whoever's like, well, actually, I would have done it this, right? Like, oh, they didn't even think. It's like, oh, no, I'm going to tell you that these are not options. So we're really, I mean, what I took away is we're just left with a whole bunch of armies just smashing into each other.
Yeah, and I think that the interesting thing about this is a chapter that kind of sets up a bunch of details that the next chapter uses really effectively. But when we think about discussing, like, is the river at high or low level, like, I don't know what that means until someone tells me later on, right? And so that's kind of the fun part about this, is it feels like the dinner party in the murder mystery where you don't quite know what the clues are, but you're trying to pay attention to all the little details. It works. I just think the payoff happens in the next chapter, and so that's when I want to talk about it. Did you have any thoughts at all about more or less this until we get to the very last couple sentences of the chapter, right? Is there any detail that stood out? Are there any of the Aiel clan chiefs who you're starting to enjoy? What did you like about the rest of the chapter, more or less?
I'm trying to remember what the last... so my one other note is on the last couple sentences. I didn't remember. I mean, there were other things I was interested in. Probably chief amongst them are these, like, mysterious spears that are just like out and shooting. And so to me, what I thought I was supposed to take away from that is there's somebody awesome in the city, and probably like a hero we haven't met yet or don't fully know. I mean, I know we have the queen and her kind of loyalists kind of separated from the throne, right? Elaine's
Different
mom.
Kingdom.
Oh.
So remember, that is Andor. This is Tyrian.
Okay.
So they are neighbors to one another, but yeah.
Good. Glad you clarified that. Pausing for an edit. And
which
good.
I will not make.
Now the audience won't know I'm an idiot. So there's somebody cool in the city, and I'm gonna go ahead and say it's somebody we don't know. It seems more likely than somebody we do know, because there aren't a lot of people who are major people we know that aren't accounted for, but could be. Yeah. It reminded me, actually, back to Lord of the Rings, but the Hobbit. There's the guy remember the guy who can shoot spears really well out of Lake Town, and he's the one who kills Smaug?
Oh, yeah, that one.
I don't remember the guy, but like, hey, here's a guy who's really good with, I don't even remember what the name of that weapon. We just use them in D&D. Ballisters?
Oh, yeah, I know what you're talking about, but it's gone. I only remember things for 1 week. I think it's actually just a bow and arrow in The Hobbit, at least. But
Ballista.
Yes,
Ballista.
That's the one.
Yes.
Yeah, I think that this is a really interesting little mystery that we'll need to figure out later on, right? And that's fun. And then Rand has a really kind of dark moment at the end of this chapter, right? He thinks, will it be enough to defeat Couladin? He's worried that if he just dies in battle, the rest of the Shido will kind of carry on and there'll be a thorn in his side for a long time.
No, it's Carrion.
And then he thinks to himself that he needs to be hard when he is battling Couladin, and he thinks that he can be as hard as he needs to be. And it's worth noting that is echoing a line that Aviendha told to him after he saw the Shan-Chan and didn't kind of attack them and even released them. She told him that he needs to be more hard when it comes to his enemies. And so he seems to have really kind of strongly internalized that, and that idea between kind of that soft versus hard, Rand is kind of, I think, very much embracing the idea that you need to not go easy on your enemies when necessary.
Yeah, and that was my final note is like, I thought of, what my limited perspective is on World War II, how, it was always said as the U.S. went island to island across the Pacific, even when the Japanese soldiers knew it was hopeless, they fought to the last breath until the very end. Yeah. And it felt like that, right? Which is it's not going to be enough to just take out the leader. You're going to have to really take out every single member of these tribes. That sounded dark, right? That like no quarter, no mercy. It sounded more in line with the Aiel than it did Rand, but I'm recognizing that those are less separate categories than they used to be.
Well, and it makes me wonder whether Rand is learning the same lesson that you are, because I think you are learning the right lesson, and he is not quite, right? What you are describing is sometimes you need to do the thing that needs to get done to finish it, right? And I think what Rand is saying is something almost closer to, like, you need to not give any quarter, you need to stoop to their level almost, right? Like he's talking about not just defeating Couladin on the battlefield, but defeating him kind of culturally, right? He wants to defeat him in terms of how he is perceived by the Aiel. And so I wonder whether when Aviendha says you need to be hard, what she means is you need to make the hard decisions. And what Rand is learning is you need to give up on your morals when necessary. And that worries me a little bit. Right? I think that you are correct in saying there is a time and place for hardness, but I think Rand is learning you should always be hard.
You've given me so many opportunities for a penis joke, and I haven't taken a single one. And for that reason, I want everybody listening to give me a round of applause because it was hard. And now let's move on to Chapter 42, Before the Arrow.
Guys, Greg said hard. It was so funny. Chapter 42. Matt rests in his tent thinking about how serious his life has become, and he has never wanted a serious life. He is thinking he is not a hero, and then he dismisses a memory of a battle in which he was a hero. He thinks his medallion keeps him safe from Aes Sedai and Moraine, and he announces to himself in his tent his intention to ride away from the battle entirely, but he still feels that he, at some point, is tied to Rand's success or failure, but he wants to get away for as long as he can. He feels like he is more able to think about and kind of declare that he is leaving than he was in the past, and he thinks that even the Taviran nature of Rand and himself pulling each other seems weaker than it had been at previous times that he thought about leaving. As he steps outside of his tent, the air outside is unnaturally warm, and he thinks that it should be late enough in August for it to be quite cool, but it isn't at all. And then Matt thinks that Moraine has actually played her relationship with Rand ideally because she is now now getting more or less everything she wants, and all she has to do is act like she is deferring to him in many cases. He thinks about the rules of battle as he is kind of looking around at the wise ones, and then he realizes that a number of these rules that he's thinking about have come from his past lives. As he arrives at Rand's tent, Jason Natail is there, but Rand is not, and Matt seems to intend to wait, but he gets a little bit uncomfortable when Natail starts studying him, and so he turns his attention to the maps with notations from the scouts about the troop movements of the Shido. He thinks that there are over 160,000 Shido, and that Rand's forces have been reduced by the bleakness, making this not an even fight, but one which is closer than they would like. Matt thinks that they have enough soldiers to defeat the one group of Aiel, the Shido in front of them, but he also thinks that there are a few other clans who are coming behind, and if they turn against them, this will be a very difficult battle. At this point, Lan arrives and asks Matt what he makes of everything, and Matt asks if there is news about whether the Aiel behind them are allies or enemies, but there is no news. Lan asks Jason Natail about tactics and gets a very dismissive answer, but then when he asks Matt, Matt dismisses him and says that Couladin is trying to get them to push him into the city, and you should not use a full all-out attack because it could push Couladin to try to go over the walls. He says it also reduces that this strategy of pushing him towards the river also reduces the risk if the other clans decide to side with Couladin, and Lan agrees, but says that it all hinges on certain assumptions about how the Aiel will respond to things, and Matt says that the best plans only last until the battle begins. Matt then realizes that he's been referencing ancient battles throughout this conversation, and he's also noticed that Jason Natail has abruptly stopped playing his harp. Matt thinks that he doesn't even know whether or not he has been speaking the Old Tongue as he's been having the conversation, and at this point Rand enters, and Matt says that he intends to leave. Rand says he'll be sorry to see him go, and Matt is surprised both that Rand isn't encouraging him to stay, and also that he does not feel any of the ta'veren tugging at him, and he says he intends to go to the south. He worries to himself that Melindra might be a problem as he leaves, and he resolves not to tell her he is leaving. Rand warns Matt off, telling Egwene that he's leaving, saying that she is too tightly tied to the White Tower, and Matt says that Egwene has left Emond's Field further behind than all of the rest of the people from the village. He shakes Rand's hand, and he feels the dragon press on his palm, and then he leaves, and he notes that there are a number of impatient Terrans waiting outside the tent, and then he whistles Jack of the Shadow to himself, not quite realizing that he's singing a song about dancing with death. At this point, we jump into Rand's point of view, and Lan says that Matt figured out their entire plan after just minutes looking at the map, and Lan says he doesn't quite understand where Matt gets this knowledge from, and Rand refuses to tell him. Rand hopes that Matt can get far away for the time being, but he also thinks that at some point Rand will need Matt, and then he also starts thinking how he can use Matt's new skills, and he thinks that he doesn't need to get any harder because he is already thinking about how to exploit his closest friends. He then commands Jason Natail to play the March of Death or any extremely sad song, and then he invites all of the other commanders in, as Lews Therin thinks that he has led hundreds of battles and doesn't need any assistance in his head. All of the leaders then enter, and the Terrans reluctantly sit with the Aiel, and then Rand thinks to himself that sadness has no place for a leader, and he cannot afford any of it at this time. This is a chapter that makes me have real doubts about how Rand is doing in leadership. We had gotten a lot of good reviews, and then now I'm not feeling great about the guy who's like, play the saddest song you know, let's plan. What were your thoughts on Rand in this chapter? And also, I thought this was just a fun Matt showcase, if nothing else.
Yeah, this would be my favorite chapter in a long time, more for that second point you just made, which is I thought it was really fun to be in Matt's head and just to see kind of where he's at within this. In my, I've never said this on the podcast before once, check the tapes. I'm a giant Star Wars fan, and why the original Star Wars succeeds is because of that briefing scene right before the climactic final battle. Like, if you think about an audience in 1977 understanding the X-Wings diving towards the Death Star, going down a trench and blowing it up, that's impossible to kind of explain, but the fact that they explain it first before they show you means that you understand what happens in the kind of crazy edited battle that follows. And just because we have some nerds who listen, yes, it's Marsha Lucas who deserves credit for that final battle success, not George Lucas. We all know nerds. So I just thought that was it was very clever to give us that, because that way we'll very much understand what's about to happen when the armies happen. And usually what that means is they say it here, right? It falls apart very quickly, but you at least understand how it's falling apart and where it's not going as they expected. But to wrap that up in this kind of really fun push-pull of Matt kind of, spewing. Actually, this one time my last job, they didn't know I was a giant Star Wars fan, and somebody asked me a question, and I like some other personality came out of my head and just vomited like a rant about Star Wars for 10 minutes. And that's essentially what Matt did here, right? He just it all flowed out, and so it was really entertaining. And then this added level of, he thought he'd been keeping a secret, and they are 100% onto him and have been tracking it and figuring it out. All of that just worked so well for me in terms of making what could be boring setup to the action really, really engaging.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with that. And I think what makes that scene work so well is that we get this very kind of deliberate, thoughtful Matt in the early part of the chapter, and then we watch that kind of slowly unwind as he kind of loses control of the conversation and gets more and more casual, and that's when he kind of starts slipping and letting all of those pieces of old knowledge out. And so I found the early part of this chapter not as fun as once he's in front of the battle maps, but really telling of Matt the planner, which I think we often forget exists because Matt, the guy who just pulls stuff out of his butt anytime he needs to, kind of takes over the second the plan falls apart. But even him just thinking about when is he going to leave town and why this battle and why not before, I think illustrates that Matt is actually a remarkably thoughtful character, given how much he just ruins all of the plans all of the time.
Well, and I'm imagining we don't have to go kind of beat by beat through what he said, because there's not a lot to say beyond your summary of it. But the ways in which he balances out and plans for double crosses and maybe 3 of them will double cross you, and if 4 double cross you, then this is lost anyway, and all that. Yeah. I really just enjoyed that kind of showcase of this other version of Matt. And then you link that to this dynamic, which I think this is the first time we've really heard it articulated, that Matt can go ahead and leave, and Rand's like, we'll see how long till I just pull him back in, right? Because that's what Tovere are going to do is kind of attract them all. And a little shout out to Perrin, absent from this book thus far, still holding out hope for the last 250 pages. So I do think that's really kind of fun to think about. It's almost a retroactive explanation for how each of the early books was structured. They'd all get very far apart, and then they'd all come back together.
Yeah, and I thought that Matt kind of comparing how he felt in Roidion, where he knew that he was being dragged along, versus now, I thought it was kind of fun seeing him almost try to work out, how do I notice that tug? He is now kind of playing the game of, I know I'm going to get yanked someday, but how far away can I get before I get pulled back in? I know it's really rough.
Stopping. We don't want an explicit rating, so I will not make your penis jokes that you're queuing me up for. Yes, and that's really fun because it's almost reassurance for me that no matter how far these characters get, they will collapse back together, and we will get to see them interact and see how much they've changed and all that. So, but then the question for me became, is Matt going to actually get away? Because he's almost left a whole bunch of times.
Yeah.
And I had been kind of assuming from the start of the chapter that he wasn't actually going to get away. But then by the end of the chapter, I was feeling more like, oh no, I think he might actually sit out this battle at least and be elsewhere and then get pulled back in a book or two.
Yeah. I also, just before we move on to kind of the serious part of this, do want to note that Matt's idea of a perfect life seems to be going from town to town and sleeping with random women, but he is very upset with his life of going from town to town and sleeping with the same woman. And I think that tells you a lot about Matt and where he is at in his life. We've all met that guy in high school.
We hang out with that guy now. Sorry, go ahead.
I thought there was one more moment kind of early on in the chapter that really stood out to me, and it was Matt as he is kind of thinking through the rules of battle. He then sees Moraine, or at least one of the wise ones, and his evaluation of Moraine is she is playing the situation exactly right. She's conceding the little things that don't matter and getting everything she wanted in the exchange with Rand, even though she is ostensibly just going along with everything he says. And I thought that was kind of a really interesting read from new Matt, right? I don't think that's something that old Matt would have picked up on, but the Battle Master is also pretty good at reading political signs, it turns out.
Yeah, and well, you just said it, but he was dead on, right? Like in all the kind of crazy mixes up that could have occurred, it was like, oh no, he's got her number more completely than Rand does, seemingly, at this particular moment.
Yeah, and that just surprises me, right? This is the guy whose reaction to Aes Sedai a book and a half ago was to wish on his magical genie lamp that they would stop bothering him, and yet he's the one who knows what's going on. I also think his read later on in this chapter that Egwene is the one who has left the two rivers the furthest behind shows that Matt he's pretty astute, despite the fact that that's not how we normally think of him. I also found Matt being really uncomfortable around Jason Natale to just be a fun detail, and Matt is clearly good at reading people. Those were kind of the three little interactions that stood out to me before he does his fun I know how the battle is going to go shtick. Was there any kind of interpersonal moments with Matt that stood out to you this chapter?
No, not really. They all worked. I was mostly excited when Lan showed up again because he continues to kind of get a back seat for a while.
He's in the book. It's exciting.
Yay. But he doesn't get all that much, but even that little bit he does where you can tell he's kind of playing Matt, he still is a very compelling character. So yay, Lan's here, but doesn't get a lot to do.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. Any thoughts on the actual battle and strategy? The odd thing that that Robert Jordan does very frequently is he kind of describes the before the battle, and then he's like, okay, a battle happened, and we'll get like 2 scenes from it. So it feels like this is kind of our establishing shot for what will very likely not be the longest battle that we've ever read. What are you kind of expecting now that we've got this kind of setup in this chapter?
I think it will not go exactly as was described, so that we get some of that drama as a part of that. It almost seems too easy that the tribes betray Rand, right? Like that's the easiest answer for how this is not going to go, that the way they think. But I feel like it's going to be something more complex and complicated, maybe something that we haven't thought about, maybe the mystery spear thing going on from the city. Like we have a few kind of all right, I'm talking to the wrong member of your household, but I really like in Star Wars Rebels when Grand Admiral Thrawn is so set on how the battle is going to go because he's a military master and he can't figure out the kind of magic force stuff. And I feel like we're going to get something like that. Like there's something that has not been put onto this fancy battle map that they're not accounting for. I don't know if that's a power of light or a power of dark, but I think there's some X factor yet to be revealed.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really interesting read about which obviously I cannot say anything. The one other kind of really fun thing that I wasn't fully able to decipher, but there's got to be something. If you are a longtime Wheel of Time reader and know the answer to this, please email us or send us a message on Threads or wherever we are. Reach out. I was looking at like the 5 or 6 battles that Matt references in his kind of discussion of all of these previous battles up against the river, and I was trying to figure out which one of them was almost certainly a reference to a real battle during the, Korean or Vietnam or some other war. Robert Jordan is such a military history person. I can almost guarantee a couple of them are like minor battles that were up against a river that he was familiar with. I just don't know that kind of military history well enough to piece it together. But I spent some time digging, and it's fun doing that detective work, even if you don't find anything.
And I kind of thought when they say avoid getting into the city, it's funny because that's the lesson of the Gulf War and then the modern Iraq War in particular. And it's like, oh, he can't be referencing that because this is from before that. So it's interesting how it's just either common military knowledge or, he's just very wise about such matters. So it was smart.
Yeah, we know that Matt's kind of visions or his memories all come from a very particular period of time, which is all after the breaking of the world. But there's a part of me that really wish Robert Jordan had let it go much further back than that, and Matt had like occasional literal Vietnam flashbacks. Like that would be amazing as far as I am concerned. Any last notes on the Matt POV portion of this chapter? I thought it was just fun to be in his head for this, and especially kind of seeing him lose control of the conversation as Lan kind of is guiding him down the path, I found to be really interesting. But I don't have too much else I can add other than this battle gonna be fun. Any last thoughts before we jump into Rand's head?
Just to say that if that's the end of Matt in this book, I'll be sad because I did find it really fun and compelling. You just alluded to his magic medallion that we predicted at the time would have such grave consequences, and then it hasn't been a part of any of the action. Yeah. So, he's been here a little bit in this book, but it does feel like, he's also taking a backseat to some of these other pieces on other parts of the continent. So it'll be sad if that's it we get from Matt, if he really just rides off and then we meet him a book or two from now.
Yeah. Now, in the last chapter, we talked about Rand kind of being kind of more and more unwilling to embrace kindness. I really, the first time I read this, thought, oh, this is just Lan asking questions about a battle. But it very quickly, I think, becomes apparent that Rand, at least to some degree, set this up to test his friend's abilities. That worries me in the context of what we were talking about in the last chapter. And then throwing in our first Luz Theron voice in a while doesn't help matters.
Yeah, and it seems that the Luz Theron voice is, doesn't give a fun because he just wants to win. And, it's interesting to compare the two kind of methods of possession here. And that, Matt's doesn't seem to be voluntary. He just kind of slips into it. Rand's is very much like giving into your dark impulses. It feels much more sinister than Matt's does.
Yeah, and yet at the same time, it seems like they're offering almost exactly the same information, right? Matt is embracing his previous knowledge because he kind of has no choice but to do so. Rand, on the other hand, literally rejects advice from someone who probably has as much battle experience in his head as Matt does collectively. And so, as much as we've been very much reading the Luz Theron voice as madness, and I think that's a very reasonable place to go, it's kind of an odd dynamic to see two characters be offered the same thing, and in one case it feels fun and bright, and in the other it feels like a harbinger of a character's doom.
Yeah, fun. Doom. Fun. And it's funny because could that then be this X factor I was just referencing? Is it going to be somebody's madness kind of breaking out, probably Rand's, and losing control of the battle? Or is this, again, kind of more of a deep tease for where this is going 2 or 3 books from now? I can't really tell.
I don't think we have too much else to say about this chapter. It's a good one. I'm excited. Yep. Let's get to the stuff. And I think we might get to the stuff next week, given the chapter titles that we have coming up. Next week, we will be covering 2 chapters. That is Chapter 43, This Place, This Day, which sure sounds like the kind of speech you'd give during a battle. And then Chapter 44.
Sorry, that was my Aragorn from Return of the King. Go ahead.
That was not Aragorn, but it was very funny.
And Chapter 44,
The Lesser Sadness. Greg, I think we need to end with an inspiring battle speech, but I don't trust you to do it in any voice other than Kermit. So what do you think is upcoming in these 2 chapters? And then say the name of the podcast.
I think we have fun and excitement ahead. Speaking of fun and excitement, I do want to indulge in some self-promotion, as Tylor told me I'm allowed to do, which is to say that I spend a lot of time in my basement podcasting. So if you're enjoying my contributions here but would like to hear me talk about things I know about, I'm currently recapping Skeleton Crew, the new Star Wars show, on the Rebel Base Card feed, which just search for Rebel Base Card wherever you're listening to us. And it's high movie season over on Long Take Review. We are racing through Oscar nominees. I think there's only one potential Best Picture nominee I haven't seen yet. So if you want to get excited about Oscars that mean nothing but are fun to play with anyway, then please follow me over to that space. That's the Long Take Review podcast. If I'm going to spend so much time in my basement in December where it's very cold, I'm so glad I can do it talking about such fun things. I do not have an inspiring battle speech ahead, but I will say that this is the first time, maybe this whole book, that I want to go right upstairs and read this, even though I probably don't get to talk to Tylor about it for a week. So if that means anything, I think next week will be a good one. Next time, Through the Glass Columns.
So ends another episode of Through the Glass Columns. We thank you for joining us and continuing with us on our quest to cover all of the Wheel of Time in our own sweet time.
This podcast features original content developed by Tylor Orm and Greg Cass and is not in any way affiliated with, associated with, or condoned by the Robert Jordan Estate, Tor Fantasy, Amazon, or our wives. All content is intended for entertainment and educational purposes only.
If you're enjoying this podcast, please seek out the books from your local bookshop or library and join us as we continue our journey. If you'd like to contact us to share your thoughts or give feedback, find us on Instagram or Threads by searching Through the Glass Columns.
Thank you once again for being a part of this community. If you're enjoying the show, please subscribe, leave us a review wherever you are listening, and recommend this show on your social media to help us grow our community. We look forward to welcoming you back next time on Through the Glass Columns.